Just 30 seconds on where I come from, because I think it provides context for what I'm going to talk about. I grew up on the East Coast, outside Boston, spent the first half of my life there, studied computer science and engineering at Dartmouth, but I've spent the last 20 years in Silicon Valley, and in a variety of small companies, some less successful than others. Big companies, I was at Apple for a few years in the dark ages of Apple before Mr. Jobs came back. And I was at Google for 8 years until about a year ago. And so a lot of what I'm going to share with today in terms of the notion of finding talent, building great teams, creating an environment for great teams, really inspired probably more than anything by my 8 years at Google. And I'll also get to the end toward how this experience led me to leave Google and found Upstart a year ago. So our story begins about almost exactly 10 years ago. This is me on the day my son came home from the hospital drinking a Guinness. I was drinking the Guinness. But the context of this is that I was working for a startup called Girouard, which most of you have never heard of. It was a video search technology, somewhat ahead of its time. Had some moderate success. I was on paternity leave and got a call that basically said, hey, well, what happened basically was the company was acquired by a company that nobody knew then, but everybody knows now, a company called Autonomy. And if you know much about that company, you'll appreciate what happened next, which is they called me and said, hey, good news, the company was acquired. And more good news, you're going to have more time to spend with your new son. So it was one of those, thanks for playing, don't come back sort of things. So my wife and I were living in San Francisco. I'd already been in the Bay Area a long time. And we thought, geez, maybe we should live closer to family. So I ended up in this bi-coastal job search, Bay Area and then Boston. And it was really a formative experience. It went on for about 6 months. I was flying back and forth. And so there was a very distinct difference between my experience on both coasts interviewing. Now, this is actually Santa Monica, New York City, which has nothing to do with my story because it's actually Boston in the Bay Area. But having said that, and I also don't want to come back out. I'm going to fall off the end okay. So, but basically it was interesting. I interviewed with the whole startup community in Boston, which, I didn't have connections. I had been away from Boston. I mean, my connections in Boston were like kids I had snowball fights with, right? So, but I was, very generously, they took me back. I had a lot of interviews, and I would always sort of lose out at the end. I would be like, I was a VP of product for this company called Girouard, nobody had heard of. I had worked for Apple, which at that point was no shining star in your resume at all. And, I would always be there and like, this guy seems pretty bright, I guess. But in the end, they would hire some, and I had been a VP of product and a VP of marketing. And in the end, there was always like some IBM guy that got the job over me. And I was like, IBM, you're kidding. Nothing against IBM, but I was like, wow. And in the Bay Area, it was very different. The culture was so different. And in the end, I ended up going to Google. But it was funny. A few months after it, I ended up speaking at this Boston or Massachusetts High Technology Conference. And I was relating this experience almost as a cautionary tale. And what I said was, the difference really was that in Boston, they wanted to hire somebody who had done it before. And in the Bay Area, they wanted to hire somebody they believed could do it. And it was a viscerally different experience. Now, this is a decade old. And I think things have changed. Now, the end of that experience was Google. And in my last interview at Google, it was probably my 6th visit to Mountain View, it was with Larry Page. And it was very interesting. I didn't know what to expect. First, we started talking about things like I had run track in college. Larry actually, believe it or not, was a pole vaulter. So we were talking about random things like this. He didn't really ask me about anything on my resume or what I had done. But we started talking about a few things. We got into this notion of, hosted applications. It wasn't called SaaS or cloud or anything like that. But, what could they do? What couldn't they do? How would you make them better, et cetera? And at some point, later on, I sort of figured out he was really trying to understand how I was thinking. He didn't really care necessarily what I had done. He cared about how I thought. But towards the end of this thing, I sort of felt like it was time for full disclosure. And I said, Larry, I have to admit, I've never worked in enterprise software at all. I know absolutely nothing about it. And he said 6 words that stuck with me ever since that epitomized what I described. He says, I'm sure you'll figure it out. And it was really, to me, it was a visceral moment of the difference between the culture I had seen in Boston, which I think has changed a lot, and a lot of people have worked hard to revive and breathe life into the startup culture in Boston, and here. And this sort of informed a lot of my thinking in many ways about hiring talent and the challenges in doing so, particularly as the economy's changed. New economy is one of those BS words I think you probably get tired of hearing. There's a couple of the really important aspects that I think are just immutable and are happening that are very compelling. If you sort of first look at the people who are in the sort of their 20s, the millennial generation, things are very different. I think it was Sunny yesterday that was saying how, the idea of 2 jobs and that's your career, very stable, very predictable, gone. You don't have a choice at that. You have to build your career. You have to define your experience and build your experience and build your own value. And that's pretty obvious. But the other side of it is also that people in this age group actually don't want that old experience. There's a Kauffman Foundation study that says 54% of millennials want to run their own companies. They actually don't want to do that. So it's almost in certain ways, it's all happening. And it's all happening very quickly that the world of employment and the relationship between employees and employers is changing. Now, on the employer side, there's actually a bigger challenge, which is the amount of disruption going on to your business in virtually every industry these days suggests that you actually don't know what you need a year from now, or 5 years from now, certainly. So that sort of adds a special twist to the hiring challenge, which is how do you hire people for a job without a description, for a job that doesn't exist yet? And that is especially hard. And it's ridiculously hard if you're following that model I saw in Boston, which was, I want to hire someone who's done it before. Doesn't exist. Never been done before. So there's a certain appreciation for that I think Google represented pretty well, which is how do you hire in that world where you don't know what you want? You don't know where you're going to be in a few years. The other thing about this, the other notion was talked about yesterday, is the notion of B players. Man, B players are dangerous, right? C and D players are pretty easy. You just have to sort of find a way to very humanely get them out of your company. B players are hard because they're usually doing a pretty good job and they're doing something important, and it's hard to just get rid of them. But B players cannot perform in unknown tasks in the future. You cannot rely on them. They sort of need more direction and need to be told what to do. And so this notion of be careful of hiring B players is even more difficult today. Now you're sitting here and go, okay, we don't know what the job is in the future. We don't really want to just look at what somebody's accomplished in the past, yet we are tasked with hiring all A players. That sounds like a pretty difficult thing. So Google's approach, I really believe, was rooted in the fact that the company is a search engine. It started as a search engine. Now, if you know much about search engines, it's an extraordinarily difficult problem, right? There's tens of billions or more documents and videos and things out on the web. And you have to decide which ones are most important to the user who's looking for something. And in the early days, the first search engines mostly looked at the words that were in the document and whether they were bold and how many times they appeared and this and that. And then Larry and Sergey had the unique insight that other people citing a document actually meant something. It sort of came from the world of academic citation, that other people pointed to a document, it probably meant it was useful. And that's what they term a signal. A signal is an enormously important thing. No signal is perfect, but the sum of signals, whether that be how many times the word appears, how many people cite a document, maybe how many times that people click through to that document when they do a search, a click-through rate of sort. These are all signals, and there's literally dozens and dozens of signals. And the task is ridiculously hard because the average search is 2 to 3 words that someone types into Google or any search engine. And the problem of bringing back exactly what they're looking for is obscenely hard. Sergey would always say that the perfect search engine knows exactly what you want and brings exactly what you need and nothing else. And it's impossible, but that's always the goal. And signals, and understanding and interpreting and weighing signals, what that's all about. Well, guess what? That's what hiring is about. That's what building great teams is about. You have to look for signals of talent, and it's an incredibly hard thing. Google naturally moved to an extremely data-driven model, probably more so than any company in history. These are the famous billboards that they would, first of all, 99 out of 100 people would see this billboard and would go, what the heck is that? But the 1% that knew what that was and would go through the process and would find their way to a website, those were the kind of people Google wanted to hire. So it sort of started by, filtering out 99% of the population with something like this. But it also had a very, very data rigorous way of assessing somebody. It looked at what school they went to and what they studied. We looked at GPA. We didn't just look at GPA. Trajectory of GPA turns out to be quite interesting. And how they did on test scores. Test scores tend to be actually more indicative of talent than GPA. A lot of things get in the way of good GPAs in college quite frequently. But test scores tend to have a little more ground truth in them. Not perfect, and there's a lot of amazingly talented people that either didn't go to school at all, didn't finish school, didn't go to schools that are that prominent, and they're phenomenally talented. So it is by no means a perfect system, but it's really a data-driven model that Google used to hire at scale. Where does human judgment come in? At some level, you could say, we'd like to just push that to the side entirely and say, no, human judgment is necessary. It's not reality, and I don't think Google ever tried to make that a reality. I mean, I would generally say that when hiring people earlier in their careers, the more the data, at least from the perspective of Google, was pretty clear about what they had accomplished at an early age. When you get a little further, you need a little more judgment. But generally, the important question is, how does the human judgment interact with the data to create the best outcome? And Google was very maniacal about making sure there was not a bias injected into a process. And I'll give you, so for example, as a hiring manager, all the way to a senior vice president at Google, you don't make decisions to hire somebody, you make recommendations to hire somebody. Based on an offer packet that has the people they interviewed with and all the statistics. You have people in their 40s getting their college grades and such, and it's an incredible process, and it can be really difficult. But the truth is, though, it's really built to make sure that human judgment is involved, but that bias isn't injected. When I was first at Google, one of the first people I tried to hire, I was brand new and very naive to how it worked. And there was this woman from my prior company, and she was a rock star. I mean, what do you do when you go to a new company? You hire the very best person you can from the old company, right? Because they're going to help you immediately. And so, of course, I went through this process and went all the way to Larry, and Larry kind of said, I'm not sure. I don't think so. And I was like, Larry, are you kidding me? This woman is amazing. She was the very best at XYZ and this and that. And he kind of said, he sent something back to me that said, in effect, the more you argue this, the more you're showing your bias. And I was like, wow, this is sort of self-defeating, isn't it? So I took another tack, which was even worse, which was, let me tell you how desperately I need this hire. And this is a real key occasion. If there's any lesson to be learned, is like, desperation for a hire is the best way to make a hiring mistake. And even the expression of needing to hire somebody, really needing that person yesterday, is a great indicator, at least it was at Google, that you're on difficult terrain and you need to watch out. So human judgment, it's actually really important. At one point, there was some analysis done by one of our founders that suggested that no more than 4 interviews were necessary. In fact, 4 interviews were really good for getting enough different opinions about that. And beyond that, we were wasting our time. It was not predictive as to how successful somebody was going to be at Google. So why were we doing it and putting people through these torturous long processes? So a lot of things like this that I think were pretty rigorous and data-driven. Now, I want to talk a bit about the environment of if you're able to hire all these A players, what sort of culture can you really make them thrive and want to stay in? And Google's won this best place to work for innumerable times. I think won it again this past year, which a bunch of people had to rub that salt in my wound because I'm not there anymore. But so a lot of people, what is it about the Google environment that makes it special? And I will say first and foremost, it's not this. It is not fancy offices and all the food that you can eat and the accessible masseuse and all this stuff. That is really, frankly, decorative and nice, but it is not central to what keeps amazing people at Google. I think there's a few things that I believe keep A players in companies, or attract and keep A players. And the first, and it's probably the most important, is A players want to work with A players. That is first and foremost, the thing that they want. And at Google, because they were so cautious early and built such a great early team, the ability to hire amazing talent years later was incredible. Guys like Ray Kurzweil went to Google this last year. Like, that's pretty amazing. A guy like Ray, with all he's done, and he says, this is the right place for me to do my next thing. And but it's the amazing thing is, if you're an engineer at Google, sitting close to Larry and Sergey, that's great. But sitting close to Jeff Dean, that is special. There are some gods of computer science at Google, guys like Rob Pike, Jeff Dean, Vince, who have sort of foundational people in the field of computer science, and the ability to just work with them, sit around with them, have lunch or coffee with them, it's incredible. So A players first and foremost care about being with A players. The second thing is really what I would just say is a big and bold mission. And I really love, if you haven't seen this this very long but compelling slideshow by Reed Hastings, the CEO of Netflix, about their culture, it's phenomenal. And you never think like a 130 slide deck would be phenomenal, but it is. And it's hard to stop reading. But one of the things, they quote from the author of The Little Prince, whose name I could not possibly hope to pronounce. Thank you. I appreciate that. I have a French surname, but it's lost on me. If you want to build a ship, and this is paraphrased, if you want to build a ship, don't ask them to collect wood and assign the tasks. Instead, teach them to yearn for the vast and endless sea. It's a simple, simple notion. But that's what A players want, right? A players do not want to be told what to do. They want to learn what's important and share a mission and have freedom to go for it. The third thing I will say that I think is really important is a culture of performance. And this is really where a lot of companies, I believe, fall off the beam. Really strong players like to know that we're here to build a great team. We are here to all be excellent. And the same Reed Hastings Netflix presentation talked about a really nice, sort of interesting way to put this, which is they said, the proper analogy for our company is not a family. It's a professional sports team. And that might sound a little harsh to some people. Family sounds a little warmer. It's true. What I really liked that they did in this, that Reed did in this presentation was they were very rigorous about performance. That low performers have to go. But in my mind, it was a very humane sort of way of thinking of building an exceptionally strong company. I'm an advisor to a CEO of a very large Fortune 100 company, and it was funny talking about when you have a giant company, you can't start from scratch. You realistically have A's and B's and C's, and that's just kind of the reality of most companies. And what do you do about that? And it was interesting. I really harkened back to this Netflix thing, and I said, let's be serious. If you have C players, what you need to do is give them a hug, thank them for their service, and give them a very generous severance package. And that's just like exactly what it says in this thing. And I said, it's a very powerful notion. You have to be humane. You have to treat people well. But in the end, if you want to be successful as a company, you have to have a culture of extraordinary performance. I want to talk a few things about Google does in this area that I think are worthy of note. And Google's not across the board great at this. So there's some areas that I think. The thing it does incredibly well is ambition. It's built into the most basic processes of the company, is what's called objectives and key results. Every employee, every department, the entire company, every quarter has what they call objectives and key results, which are what are the things that are going to make a difference this quarter, a very small handful of things that we're going to try to accomplish this quarter. It's not a laundry list of to-dos. It is very difficult to achieve very hard objectives. They are designed for you to fail. If they're too easy and you think you can accomplish them, they're designed improperly. They are designed for you to fail. A 0.7 out of 1 is considered great. And that's sort of the way I think Larry culturally thinks about Google, which is far better to fail at something extraordinary and really ambitious than to succeed at something that doesn't matter. In fact, the worst evil you can you can do at Google is not to suggest something that is so crazy it just can never work. The worst thing you can do is suggest something that's likely to work but really doesn't matter. And that's a very different way to think about it. And Larry also, you could never outflank Larry on ambition. Never. If you went into Larry and said, hey, I have a plan to cure the common cold in 8 weeks, he would just say, why can't you do it in 6? And I'm like not kidding. Like you thought you had an ambitious plan of some sort, and it just always wasn't. The scope wasn't big enough. Why wouldn't you build it for the whole world? Why would you build it for these, mere billion people? So, and I think that culture is pervasive at Google, and it's one of the things that keeps it fresh. Another thing, we've heard a lot yesterday about, sort of acceptance of failure. And I really believe a lot of companies give, sort of lip service to this. And you have to have a degree of success as a company in order to do it, to be honest. But Google is really especially good at this. Sheryl Sandberg told me once about, and if you haven't been paying attention for a long time, she was at Google for a long time before her current role at Facebook and Lean In and such. And she told me about once how she had made this decision, which I can't even recall the details of, trying to solve a problem at Google that ended up costing several $1 million. And went in to see Larry and said, like, I'm really sorry, this was a stupid idea. It didn't work, and I think I just blew whatever, X million dollars. And Larry said, like, thanks and congratulations. I want you to keep trying. I want you to make similar mistakes. I want you to, because that's how you're going to do amazing things here. And she just was like, wow, I came to apologize. And in any case, that I think is very pervasive. Again, a culture of success allows you to have that sort of thing. Another big thing at Google that I think did really well is trust and transparency. And there's a few examples of that. Some of them are parochial, perhaps, or not that important. This picture here is actually a tech stop, which basically means that every floor of every building at Google, there's a tech stop, which is if you need anything to be productive, your computer, your phone, whatever dies, you forgot your adapter, doesn't matter what it is, you can just walk in and grab it. And amazingly talented people that will help you resolve whatever it is. And the notion that, particularly as an engineer at Google, like you need to be productive, you need to have exactly what you need to be productive, and we trust that you're not going to abuse this and go start, taking home computers, et cetera, et cetera. There's a huge amount of trust that goes with that, and I think it's almost virtually never abused. Another thing, of course, was that Eric would always go through the board of directors slides with the entire employee base. And that's just an astounding thing. People find that to be bizarre that somebody could do that, and they just were religious about it. And that is something I think, a lot of companies have issues with leaks and stuff getting into the press that shouldn't. And I think the culture of trust and responsibility was hugely important to Google being able to be that transparent. It's never perfect. If you aim for perfection in these regards, you'll go back to being, the closed approach. But it worked extremely well at Google. And then there's the TGIF. Now, this like every company says, yeah, we have the Friday thing. I was just always amazed that literally after a dozen years or more, Larry and Sergey would show up virtually every Friday, and still do as far as I know. I think it's Thursdays now for some reason. And would take questions, not only talk about the company, they would take questions from anybody. And it was incredible. I mean, to think about, that's a long period of time, be there every week, ready to talk with the employees as founders, and yet they did it. Pretty amazing. So I took a lot of these ideas, and let me tell you how Upstart came into being. It was informed a lot by my experience at Google and how we hired. But I met a bunch of people almost by happenstance, maybe a year and a half ago now, who were sort of just coming out of college, or out of grad school in a couple cases, talking about what are you going to do with yourself? What do you want to do? And I detected a pattern. And the pattern was this. I have this thing, which I've come to call Plan A, I want to do. It tends to be entrepreneurial and risky, and I don't know if it's going to work. It's research with a professor, but we don't know if we're going to own the intellectual property. It's this other idea that might or not work. But instead, I'm actually going to go with Plan B, which is I'm going to take this job I'm not particularly excited about because I have student loans, because I have credit card debt, because my parents want me to take the job. Getting a job, that's a good thing, right? So I've detected this, and I was thinking, wow, this is kind of bad for them. They're not getting to pursue what they want, and it's bad for us because we actually need people out there creating jobs. I'm doing the research and saying, wow, almost all job creation is happening in small and new businesses, not in large businesses. There's virtually no net job creation in large businesses. Yet all these people coming out of school standing in line to get jobs in large businesses because they have to pay back their loans, et cetera, is a recipe for disaster. There's not enough of them, and by the way, they don't really want them. And then I was sort of reflecting on at Google how we hired people. We got very analytic about looking at what someone had accomplished, looking at what school they went to, what they studied, their scores and such. And I said, if that can really identify their potential for success at Google, it can identify their potential for success in the greater economy. And that really became Upstart. Upstart is a very simple idea that as a young person, it's a derivative of Kickstarter. It's Kickstarter for people. You probably might see us on AngelList. But basic notion is you can raise capital in exchange for a small share of your future income for 10 years. So it's a marketplace. On one side, it's people raising capital to pursue what they really want to do, being able to get rid of their student loans, get rid of their debt or what have you, or just provide some living expenses, some buffer. And on the other side, it's people who actually have the chance to invest in a person and help them and be their backer and their mentor and support them. So in my view, it's more of a social network than it is a bank, but it really is an interesting and new concept. And so let me just say that it was almost exactly a year ago today that I resigned from Google to do this. And I'm supposed to have one more slide, but it looks like it didn't make it. But it was a very difficult day for me. I had been there 8 years. I loved the company. I was in an amazing role there. I had a team of over 1,000 people. There's just so much like there. And in many ways, I felt I had let down my team. I felt, in other ways, I was letting down my family. So it was, it was not an easy thing to walk away from that, to do something fresh. But so I came home the day that I resigned, and my family all had Upstart t-shirts. Wish I had a picture of, but somehow it didn't make the cut. Yeah, so you can see the Upstart. Anyway, my mother-in-law, God bless her, went out to the internet and bought Upstart t-shirts. So my kids, my wife, anyway. And it was great. And my family was incredibly supportive. My daughter, who's now 8, was 7 at the time, said, "Do we still get to use Google?" And I assured her that I had secured a lifetime rights to use Google for free. And a few months after that, we were set up as a company. We were in this little office in Palo Alto. And my son, who was in that first picture that you saw, was going to come by our little office in Palo Alto. And he came in, and he looked around and he said, "Where's the slide?" And I said, "There's no slide here, but we get to come here every day." There was about 6 of us at the time, and work at these 2 tables and create something really awesome and new so that people can do what they want to do, what they're meant to do. And he said, "That's better than Google." Anyway, I don't know if there's time for questions or if we're done. Jason, Steve, are we done? Yes? You can ask before they give me the hook.
I don't.
Well, my startup, it's interesting. It has an incredibly, even a year in, a really strong culture, and I can't even say that I've defined it so much. It's just emerged out of and it is just so particular. In fact, in the last few months, we've interviewed over 100 engineers and made 1 offer. And mostly it's for cultural fit. And the team is just so passionate about it. It's, of course, looking for amazing talent, but I mean, the premium put on people who believe the mission, care about the mission, can really get behind it is So far, so good, though I literally, one of the several things that keep me up at night is, oh my God, we haven't hired anybody in like 3 months, and this is not good. So it's really hard. It's really hard. There it is. So, last question, or?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure.
My question is, I'm a young person, but so while doing like things that I really want to do and doing things that are important, being entrepreneurial, my grades in school have suffered slightly because of this. And like I personally feel that what I've done is important and what I've done is worth it, and it is better than my grades. But then now like all these analytics showing it's like, well, you didn't get those marks on those tests, but and this is what's kept me out of my school's computer science program, right? My GPA was just not up to par. Right?
Yeah.
What do you think about these things?
Well, no signal is perfect, and certainly grades are far from perfect. A lot of people, for great reasons, have other foci in their lives at that time. So I guess in my mind, our view is for Upstart, and we view what is everybody has potential, and to the extent you can identify it, you can sort of allow somebody to invest in it and grow it. Where it doesn't mean because you have certain grades you can't participate in, I think, is sort of a faulty way. But there is a thing, certainly at Google, where there was a premium put on high GPAs, and there's a lot of debates about it. And without question, did Google miss great people? Yes, absolutely. And did it hire some people with amazing credentials who actually weren't a great fit and couldn't perform? Yes, But overall, if you balance the signals and understand it, and you understand, well, look at this other thing this person did.
They're switching to
without the GPA. Even though their GPAs may not be great, look at these other things they accomplished. Overall, I think that's a reasonable approach.